Hello, and greetings, my viewers, to what could potentially be the longest episode so far. We're going to be talking about Operation Lumberjack, where the plucky and independent coalition of Pato managed to fight off the increasing growth of the authoritarian empire that Wolcadia has built. Before watching the video, take a look at my main channel and Micah's channel. I'm sure that the Ethiopian government will give him a talking to as well. And keep democratic principles in mind. Keep in mind that the Ethiopians, the Cascadians, and the Atlanticans are fighting a war to liberate the Wolcadian people, not commit atrocities. Our goals are noble here, and if you disagree, don't use unfounded conspiracy theories or authoritarian talking points or misinformation. Now, we begin by talking about Pato's growth, the resilience of Pato in the face of Wolcadian oppression. Ethiopiana, Cascadia, and Atlantica are the three founding members of Pato. Keep in mind that Atlantica is an ally of Ethiopiana because most Ethiopians perceive Atlantica as a nation, as a more democratic pathway for Wolcadia's future. Atlantica has also cemented itself as a Pato nation, with the disgrace of more pro-Wolcadia politicians as of late. Also, as this is going on, Wolcadia's alliance with Britain has pretty much ended by this point. There's no more of a use now that Britain lost their dominion in Canada. There can't be peace between these nations. There can't be a full alliance as long as Britain is allied with Wolcadia. And France has basically shown a new path within Europe because France has agreed to Pato-based doctrines. And, for example, the Reformed faith. France has done a tremendous job at making sure that the proper form of Thorax faith that is acknowledged is the evolved faith, is the faith of progress. Also, anti-colonial guerrilla fighters and liberation fighters have been supported throughout much of Wolcadia. So we see a future that is more balanced, that is more democratic, that is more willing and committed to a more progressive outlook as time goes on. Now, despite the prevailing anti-Wolcadia sentiment within Pato, delegates from Ethiopiana and Cascadia extended an unexpected olive branch to Emperor Frederick of Wolcadia. They proposed a significant diplomatic gesture, a united conference bringing together key dignitaries from both sides to explore the potential for Wolcadia's entry into Pato through constructive negotiations. In short, the Ethiopians and Cascadians and Atlanticans, they want to bring Wolcadia into Pato. Now, why would they do that? The idea is, if Wolcadia enters Pato, they will be subject to negotiations and treaties regarding this alliance. Play ball with the rest of the world. If Wolcadia doesn't enter Pato, Wolcadia will have proven itself to be an outcast. And as you'll see, the Wolcadians won't enter Peto. Spoiler alert, but not really a spoiler. So, we shall soon begin the discussion. Negotiation begins in a small Macanese restaurant. The three of them arriving at 5 in the morning. After a long, long journey. Out from a royal carriage was Emperor Frederick, an old man who had seen many years. The stern look on his face contrasted his elegant demeanor, which even in old age was still very present. Despite his royal descent, he wore no gold or jewelry due to his religion, instead preferring to dress in a way symbolizing his responsibility, without emphasizing his wealth. Out from a Lamborghini came the leaders of the two nations, Cascadia and Ethanopiana. They were both clean-shaven and wore simple suits, exemplifying their roles as presidents of democratic nations. Though both were carrying pamphlets and treatises on human rights and democracy, the Cascadian president carried with him a Bible as well, representing his strong commitment to his faith. The two of them walked out the doors of the Lamborghini and entered the restaurant, prepared for a long, complex, and multifaceted discussion. Upon their arrival at a small table, light appetizers and drinks were ordered, except the fine soju enjoyed by Frederick, due to the natural immunity to alcohol of his people. The food was light and eclectic, an assortment of seafood and octopi. Specifically, the musicians were in the back of the restaurant. Although they normally played music inspired by their old homelands of Macau, Russia, and Japan, they played the anthems of Wolcotia, Cascadia, and Ethanopiana before taking leave for the three leaders to discuss their political affairs. Greetings, most noble and esteemed heads of state and governments. You may have your grievances with us, and I may have my grievances with you. But until our departure from this restaurant, nay, this colony, we shall be brothers. May God bless you, and I hope that your journey and arrival was uneventful. I wouldn't say uneventful. Last night, we had to face off protesters in this city. Protesters most likely paid by you and your government. Had I been the dictator that many say I am, I would have disbanded the protests immediately. However, I have neither the right nor desire to put down this peaceful protest, as I cannot hinder the freedom of speech enjoyed by my subjects. I have many questions on that, but let's cut to the chase and get the show on the road. We didn't come here for pleasantries. We came to talk about business. So, Emperor Frederick, let's hear what you've got on the table, and let's see if we can find some common ground. Very well. We shall get to business. In regards to joining Peto, I have reservations. Although it is within Wolcotia's interests to negotiate a peaceful solution to our ongoing disputes, we must be able to find a way to promote this solution without disturbing the territorial integrity of the Wolcotian nation, or its national values. So I have got together a treaty, a peace treaty, or a treaty for future peace. One that shall see Wolcadia's entrance into Peto. This treaty has 3 requirements. 1. Transition your stance on colonial reform into a federation of equals to a stance on colonial autonomy and eventual independence. 2. Enact meaningful democratic reform, offering equal rights for everyone in Wolkadia. This includes recognizing the evolved faith as a sect of Thorax faith and making a special Bill of Rights for Christians. 3. Handle all disputed territory within Ethanopiana and Cascadia in a cordial manner. This includes a mandated reunification of Ethanopiana and a referendum over Narsland. These demands are harsh, but designed to foster stability and cooperation within the region. We trust that you and Wolkadia share our commitment to peace and prosperity for all, and we look forward to further discussions to explore the possibility of a mutually beneficial partnership with Pato. Look, I have proposed diplomacy, but every single one of these points is contrary not only to my national interest, but to the very sovereignty of the people you claim to support, their liberation. In regards to democratic reform, the last time Wolkadia was a democracy, the nation fell apart. In regards to colonial reform, every inch of colonial and disputed territory is just as Wolkatian as I am, until proven otherwise by referendums. In regards to the evolved faith, it is my duty not only to my country, but to God that is preventing me from recognizing it. If you want a proposal, I have one too. This proposal is, in fact, a reasonable diplomatic sentiment, a treaty for the People's Kingdom to join Pato. First, you shall recognize the Wolkotian government and colonial empire as it is. Do not push for reform or decolonization. 2. Get rid of or reform pro-American reunificationist sentiment. At the very minimum, explain that you shall not repeat the same mistakes that America made in the 1840s. As the president of Ethanopiana, it goes against my nation's constitution to sign your foolish and anti-democratic demand. This also goes against Cascadia's interests. Are you serious that you do not want to help Christians in Wolkadia or your religious compatriots who follow a slightly different version of Thorax faith? In regards to the rights for Christians, there is a Church of Wolkadia. Its headquarters are in the province of Rochland. It has plenty of rights, equal rights. There's no law discriminating against it. There is no law telling followers of the Church of Rochland that they are not equal citizens, and they cannot do what a common citizen can. There is no special tax or jizya imposed on Christians. It is not harsh, it is not terrible, it is we are tolerant of Christians. We are also tolerant of proper Thracians as well. Anyone who enters Wolkadia, you could be an atheist. You are not going to get exiled by our law. Why should the People's Kingdom of Wolkadia give rights to a minority that it does not give to the majority? I understand that. It is about prioritizing the underserved. Christians in Wolkadia have been marginalized and pushed to the sidelines for decades, if not centuries. Don't forget the Great Purge that you are guilty of, akin to Stalin's atrocities. If you want to say that I was not perfect at that time, I would understand you. We were in a time of chaos and crisis, a time in which we could not afford the luxuries that you have, and the luxuries that we have now. Beyond this, I would like to ask you a question. How many people died in this great purge? According to the United Nations itself, according to representatives from the International Criminal Court when they tried to press charges against me, the amount of people who died, 400 died and 1,000 were arrested. Why? Pedophilia, terrorism, corruption. If you dare call me a man akin to the atrocities of Hitler, you have no idea what you're talking about. It's notable how you completely forgot the matter of evolved Thorakians in this discourse. I ignored the evolved faith because it is such a non-issue. Evolved faith, it was founded by you as well as the President of France. Neither of you are Thorakian, or even members of this sect. This supposed sect. Not even the most radically anti-Wolcottian Old Faithers would even dare to touch the so-called evolved faith with a 10-foot pole. Then, it is settled. You fail to understand the growing importance of secularism, human rights, and reform in an ever-changing world. You fail to realize that your doctrine of thorax faith is outdated and is superstitious. You fail to realize even the most basic tenet of your so-called religion of tolerance and love. Because of this, it is no wonder why the Federal Republic of Ethanopiana, the Republic of Cascadia, and the Federal Republic of Atlantica shall not give you entry into Pedo. You are eating too high on the hog, and because of that, you will choke on your own ashes. The first few months that followed Wolcottia's failed negotiation with Pedo, I am happy to report that nothing happened. There was still the threat of international diplomacy looming against Wolcottia, though the People's Kingdom still remained a hostile imperial power. What Pedo members gained was far more valuable than any Wolcottian membership. They gained legitimacy throughout the world stage. No longer was Pedo only an alliance to unite anti-Wolcottian or pro-American reunificationist nations throughout North America. It was now an alliance to support and defend human rights. Still, Cascadia and Ethanopiana had to protect their nations from foreign invasion at any time. And through this, a plan was made known as Operation Lumberjack upon a Wolcottian attack. Though the hands of the People's Kingdom would be the ones to attack the forces of democracy first. The goal of this operation was the self-defense of the North American continent. Funds would be sent to anti-colonial groups within Wolcottia's colonies, along with pro-democracy groups, as well as the nation's military, that would strike an offensive towards their capital city. Within Cascadia, it's not like the broader Cold War between the British and Soviets stopped. But this time, the side of Britain, which stood for the continuation of imperialist ideology, was replaced by a less imperial Britain. Despite the Communist Party's initial support of Cascadia, the Cascadian government officially banned all communist movements, while Ethiopiana continued to remain neutral in the Cascadian-Soviet Cold War. The focus was to fight against Volcadia. This peace lasted for several months until an unprecedented attack occurred on a small Cascadian estate known as Hethron Farm. The terrorists, Volcadian nationalists attacking the border with Cascadia, brutally tortured the residents of Hethron Farm and blew up the entire estate with the idea of destroying the evidence. Upon the finality of this destruction, nothing was seen except burnt ruins and the mangled bones of its residents. The Volcadian government claimed to have nothing to do with this, but Cascadian officials appealed to UN investigators to see who the true attackers were. Following a lengthy UN investigation, it was revealed that the attackers had ties to the Volcadian government. No surprise. Thus, President George Wallace of Cascadia immediately spoke to the United Nations with a long speech prepared for the Volcadians. President George Wallace of the Cascadian Republic, direct this speech at you, Emperor Frederick, so you may learn of your nation's mistakes and seek to bring true peace and justice throughout your nation. If your nation is a people's kingdom, how come you do not listen directly to your people and bring democratic reform? If your nation is truly modern and civilized, how come it's governed by the regressive Thorax faith? If you seek to turn your colonial empire into a federation of equals, how come your army is sent against freedom fighters in the Philippines? And if you truly wish peace, order, and justice throughout the world, how come you bombed our Hethron Farm? I could be mad at the entirety of Volcadia, and I could be mad at you, but I'm not. I simply want to teach you a lesson about the integrity, strength, and forgiveness of the Cascadian nation, and how you can improve your empire to better operate under international law. To do this, I have established an ultimatum for your nation. You will have 1 month to make significant progress on it, or your nation will suffer under the consequences of its own actions. The points of this operation are as follows: decolonize, demilitarize, and democratize. Remove your empire, get out of Northland, your perceived Northland. Get out of your throne, Emperor, and bring the power to the people so they may elect their own representatives, and get rid of your military. Remove its hierarchical and authoritarian structure, and allow it to be formed under the light of Cascadia. Until such progress is made, you will have to answer a question. What side are you on? Will you persist in aligning with the shadows of history long since cast out more than 50 years ago?
Or will you choose to join the ranks of civilized and prosperous democracies, civilized and prosperous nations that are pushing towards a better future? You could have it all the recognition, the honor, and the respect that your nation deserves. But you need to reform first. The choice rests with you, Emperor Frederick, and I'm sure that you know what you're talking about.
I understand your concerns, President George Wallace, but I might state that there has been no proof that my government has been involved in such actions against your great nation. So far, the United Nations has refused any neutral observers into the investigation, blocking delegates from Australia, Virginia, India, and Pakistan. The fact of the matter that two rival nations wish to cooperate with each other to resolve a far-away conflict, and yet were blocked by the United Nations, which claims to represent peace, is absolutely laughable. Once more, you continue to support your supposed anti-imperialist sentiment more than the people that are supposedly oppressed by the People's Kingdom by stating that the terrorist guerrillas responsible for the burning of churches, hospitals, and schools are freedom fighters. The delegates here from Frederickland representing our People's Kingdom, many of which are from the Philippines, some of which can barely speak any Wolcotian at all, have strong words to say in their own native tongue about these so-called independence fighters. In regards to democratic reforms, one must note that democracy failed in Wolcotia every time it was implemented. The 1920s were a horrifying time for Wolcotians, as they were practically owned by corporations and unable to express their grievances. Freedom of speech technically existed at that time, but it is far stronger today than under any democratic regime. The Wolcotian people have never prospered under a foreign system, and you of all people should have to know what it is like to fight for independence if you boast about it so much. For that reason, I am obliged not to abide by the ultimatum of President George Wallace of Cascadia. I wish for further diplomatic discussion, and I am even willing to stand up against some nationalistic generals and politicians to compromise. But I will hold my ground when it comes to God, when it comes to truth, and when it comes to sovereignty. President George Wallace, if you wish to give us an iron fist, we are willing to respond with a rose of kindness. I invite you to come to Wolcotia, see its people, and take a tour of the empire. Despite historical grievances, I am sure that my subjects will respect their emperor and treat you and other Cascadian delegates with nothing but the utmost of generosity and compassion. May both of our nations prosper. The Lord is the divine source of creation. He who is greater than all is greater than all. The honored, blessed, and great, most beautiful, most powerful, most righteous, and most loving. Amen.
Wolcotia's refusal to abide by the ultimatum set up by the Cascadian government led to a variety of sanctions brought against Wolcotia and a series of anti-Wolcotian sentiment abroad. In a public address by George Wallace, Wolcadia was deemed unable and unwilling to cooperate with Cascadia and the rest of the world, and a military buildup and international coalition was ensured by the Cascadian government. This coalition was still fairly small compared to Wolcadia, consisting only of Atlantica, Cascadia, and Athanopiana, but it was large enough to gain international sympathy and respect. Not only that, it was large enough to control the narrative. Coalition militaries arose and fortified their positions near the Wolcadian border, preparing a defense against another Wolcadian attack. After an eventual skirmish occurred, President George Wallace firmly and bravely laid out the solution.
My fellow Cascadians, today, as we stand on the precipice of history, I address you with a heart heavy with the weight of responsibility and a determination forged in the fires of adversity. Once again, the shadow of Wolcadian aggression looms over our land, testing not only our resolve, but the very fabric of our democratic ideals. For too long, we have watched as the People's Kingdom of Wolcadia tramples upon the rights of its citizens and disregards the principles of justice and freedom. Their leadership, shrouded in the cloak of authoritarianism, seeks to impose its will through fear and oppression, ignoring the cries of the oppressed and silencing dissent with ruthless efficiency. But today, we say no more. Today we rise our voices in defiance of tyranny and oppression. We stand united in our commitment to democracy, liberty, and justice for all. The recent skirmish along our border serves as a stark reminder of the dangers posed by Wolcadian aggression, and we will not stand idly by as they continue to threaten the peace and stability of our region. To Emperor Frederick and his regime, I issue this solemn warning. Your days of unchecked aggression are numbered. The people of Wolcadia deserve better than the iron grip of tyranny and the stifling embrace of religious dogma. We will not rest until every man, woman, and child in Wolcadia knows the freedom enjoyed by Cascadia's citizens. To the Wolcadian people, the freedoms you enjoy will be far more worth it than anything your empire has to offer. Come with us. We are taking the fight down to the Emperor, and we're telling him no more. And to our brave soldiers, I offer my deepest gratitude and unwavering support. You are the guardians of liberty, the defenders of democracy, and the vanguard of justice. As you march into battle, you do so knowing that your nation stands beside you. May God bless Cascadia, for we shall remain triumphant. Amen.
The special military operation began on March 15th, during the middle of a Thracian holiday known as Hiernos. The Cascadian government believed that this would demoralize the Wolcadian people and military, who would normally be celebrating a holiday after a long time of fasting and preparation. However, this had the opposite effect, as Thracian priests broadcasted powerful sermons of self-defense against immense adversity throughout the entire country. The Volkadian military was sent on the attack, initiating Operation Trotsky as a plan to destroy Cascadian forces. Their advance started strong with the capture of several important Cascadian towns along the way, but they were bogged down by these advancements and forced to retreat. Despite the larger amount of men in the Volkadian military and the zeal throughout the nation, the reality was that Volcadia was exhausted by other conflicts before this war even started. They were unprepared completely for a war on this scale, as their opponents were primarily guerrilla fighters. It also did not help that the current commander of the Volkadian armed forces, Marshal Stelyan Akalis, made a few strategic blunders against the Cascadian army. Upon Akalis' orders to retreat, he was replaced by a new commander. Now, beyond this, and despite the immense success of Volkadia's army and the immense advances of Volkadia itself, something else began to occur. Volkadian soldiers, although they generally treated the land humanely, they tended to get a little self-assured, and that was another strategic blunder. Volkadia's new military commander was a man by the name of Farid Hassanov. Under his command, Volkadia's strategy immediately switched to defensive operations. He immediately taught his sub-commanders and soldiers how to speak the Azeri language, using it as a code for his military. Almost no one of Azeri descent was in Cascadia, let alone the Cascadian army, so this happened to be perfect. He also began plans to slowly move Volkadian soldiers out of the colonial war, though this was considered a controversial move even then, as the Volkadians were not expecting a long and protracted war. As much as Hassanov's plan was brilliant, it was also bogged down by internal bureaucracy. Various politicians continued to debate about the future, and when Atlantica joined the Cascadian-led coalition to attack Volkadia, they were able to break the stalemate faced by the two nations. The Volkadian military did indeed make a few additional pushes against the leaders of Cascadia and Atlantica. The latter two nations were expecting poor, starving, and oppressed Volkadians to welcome them as liberators. The sheer strength of Volkadia's propaganda machine and perceived prosperity within the nation led to the Volkadian people being fanatic. This was the epitome of Cascadia's errors in this battle. They were capable of winning this war at that time, and this led to leaders like Wyatt Hudson of Cascadia and John Valcon of Atlantica ordering their soldiers to enter defensive positions as they realized how powerful Volkadia's trench warfare was. Now, we must talk about conditions on the home front. Life within Cascadia, though initially troubling in the west due to Volkadian occupation, was fairly decent. Yes, there were some Cascadians who reported being mistreated by Volkadian forces, but they were generally friendly in their occupation. A similar mood remained around the Atlantican border, in which many Atlanticans basically didn't even notice that the war was going on. The two nations were greatly helped by a sympathetic international community that recognized the coalition's effort against Wolcadia as a David and Goliath story. International news coverage showed images of Cascadian soldiers liberating their towns and villages from Wolcadian control. Radical and hostile sermons from Thracian priests, and the continued advances of the coalition. Although some Wolcadians accused the international press of bias, the more democratic nature of the anti-Wolcadian coalition requires an honest and critical outlook on the war rather than a neutral one. Due to the outstanding work of journalists encouraging international aid to the coalition, Wolcadia fell under even heavier sanctions. Outside of Wolcadia and its colonial empire, the nation's culture was viewed with a critical lens, and many nations sought to severely reform it. Traditional Thorax faith was banned in many countries as a relic of a bygone past, with those continuing to follow it being recognized as the extremists that they are. Rather, the more reformed and progressive evolved faith denomination was given precedence, encouraging Thracians to view Wolcadia with a critical and nuanced language. Other elements of Wolcadian culture, such as its language, flag, cuisine, and art, were either trivialized or looked at with suspicion. The teaching of Wolcadian as a foreign language also vastly declined, as nobody wanted to learn about the culture of an obvious aggressor. Trade relations with Wolcadia, its colonies, its allies, and even nations that refused to take part in this embargo were also blocked among many European nations, though not everyone was as radical. Although the Wolcadian economy was sanction-proof, it did affect many things, and the Wolcadian people grew more impoverished day by day. However, the Wolcadian people were brainwashed into their anti-democracy ideology, and negotiations for an armistice were eventually planned in the neutral Republic of Varia, though neither side was willing to compromise for the sake of peace. Now, within this war, within this negotiation, political leaders within Varia essentially fought hard for a peace. The Cascadians demanded Wolcadia to at least give up their claimed territories and impart some type of promise to try to reform, and the Wolcadians did not budge in their sovereignty. Because of this, nobody signed it. Democratic reform in this peace treaty is non-negotiable. However, one Paedo nation known as Atlantica was willing to pull out of the war in exchange for some war reparations funded by the Wolcadian government. The Atlantican military was outraged at this peace treaty, and soon they made a coup d'etat against the government, bringing Richard Nixon into exile instead of fully executing him, as he remained anti-Wolcadian. Although most within Atlantica recognized that that coup was an essential part of preserving democracy, a few citizens of Atlantica perceived this coup d'etat to be a operation meant to infringe on them. Some rebels rose up in the western region, most notably the Glaciarans, who are of Volcadian descent. Their goal was to establish a pro-Volcadia regime that would either be neutral in the war or allied with Volcadia. But, unfortunately for them, the war came knocking down. While the Imperial Liberation Army of Volcadia came running into Atlantean territory to help the rebels, they were met with resistance. As soon as they approached the city of Chicago, the combined might of Atlantean and Cascadian forces pummeled down the Volcadians and showed them that there was no way they could move forward. After a long, grueling 6 months, the Volcadian military was forced to retreat. Well, that's what I'd like to tell you, but in reality, they happened to advance, and they stormed through Indiana, and they nearly seized the capital of Atlantica in Cleveland. Though, even then, they were pushed to the absolute limit. And the Atlanticans were ready to crush them when a new development emerged. Despite his earlier display of incompetence, Marshal Achilles of Volcadia still had a role to play in the war, even if it was not a primary one. He was put in charge of the Imperial Liberation Army's divisions within the southwestern and southeastern corridor, rightful Ethanopianan territory. Essentially, he knew that the Ethanopianans were not modernized at all, and thought he could simply rely on the better technology the Volcadians had, and, of course, the more powerful Navy, Army, and Air Force. But that was blocked by 3 Ethanopianan leaders who happened to be great at tactics. General Antoine Sokolov, Air Marshal Jasper Crown, and Admiral Liam Dubois of Ethanopiana were highly capable military leaders, even if the forces they commandeered were technologically inferior, less united, and weaker in number. Although Ethanopianan President Charles Osawanch was divided on sending men against Volcadia, he soon realized that the best chance in reunifying the island under his rule was now. The Federal Socialist Republic of Ethanopiana made a surprise attack on Volcadian forces, encircling the colonies by claiming the Aleutian Islands. These islands were first bombed by the Ethanopianan Air Force and then seized by Ethanopianan ground troops and paratroopers. Although some civilians were hurt, the damage was negligible compared to other events within the war. Following this, the Ethanopianan Navy made a stark attack against both corridors, believing strongly in immediate success. Despite the brilliance of the Ethanopianan strategy, the Volcadian forces held out for much longer than anticipated. Though the southeastern corridor was claimed within a week, it took a whole 6 months to claim the southwestern corridor due to the zealous nature of its defenders. Even after the surrender of Volcadia's Imperial Liberation Army, many guerrillas made it hard for the Ethanopianans to fully take control over the city. On March 3, 1976, Ethanopiana took full control over Tartan City, seizing a contingent of the Volcadian Liberation Army and Navy in the process. These Volcadian soldiers were sent to government-run de-radicalization
programs where they learned the importance and superiority of democracy, while the Athanopianan command worked on the modernization and improvement of the nation's military. The initial conflict with Volcadia allowed the nation to become more battle-hardened, improving the Athanopianan forces. Following reunification, the Athanopianan military wasted no time in precision strikes focused on Volcadian military bases and oil depots. Although the initial strikes often led to aerial battles and Volcadia ruled the skies for now, a significant depletion of Volcadia's already exhausted eastern military had to come and fight against Athanopiana. The heroic Battle of Midway dealt a huge blow against the Imperial Liberation Navy, allowing Athanopiana to cut off ties between the Volcadian mainland and the territories occupied under its brutal colonial rule. Admiral Tohar Vakhnul of Volcadia soon gathered his men to strike a blow at the Athanopianans in a risky battle nearby the Aleutian Islands. The Volcadians proved victorious against the powerful onslaught of Athanopiana, leading to the Athanopianan press calling it the Battle of Total Defeat. This battle led the Volcadian and Athanopianan governments not to come to a peace, but for a new front to be opened in the war. Remember how I mentioned the Volcadian troops going up into Cascadia? Well, it is time for the Cascadian troops to go down into pure Volcadian territory. Athanopiana's war to dominate the Pacific and Cascadia's war to reclaim Atlantica lasted 2 years. Each nation tried their best to hold on to and defend their territory, but it seemed that peace on favorable terms was nearly impossible. More and more within these countries believed it was high time to give up and let the Volcadians win. But Marshal Antoine Sokolov of Athanopiana and High Marshal Wyatt Hudson of Cascadia met in a clandestine location within Nunavut, speaking of the ultimate strategy to dominate North America. The resort was soon decided. A land invasion and encirclement of Volcadian troops was the only solution. Soon, an eventual plan was carried out, with Cascadian armed forces traveling down into Volcadian land and Athanopianans landing in several undisclosed locations nearby the Volcadian coast. Following the establishment of several beachheads, the ultimate plan was simple: cause maximum chaos. Although Athanopianan landings were eventually repulsed, enough troops were diverted for Cascadia to wage its war on the Volcadian mainland. After a long bombing campaign, followed by a landing of Cascadian troops, many were entered to able Volcadia's northern forests. As part of a souvenir process, several Cascadian soldiers tore off the branches of Volcadian trees to take back home as souvenirs, often turning them into wooden canes and other material. Some of these trees were simply cut down as a symbol of the Cascadian eagle's triumph against the Volcadian tree, though the Cascadian Environmental Protection Agency requested that this practice be stopped. Regardless, the fighting in Volcadia was rough and severe. Its guerrillas were fanatic zealots, making Cascadia pay for each piece of land they could gain with their blood. The Volcadian army was also powerful, with their morale and resolve kept up by their religious devotion. However, several major Volcadian divisions were encircled by Cascadians as the bombing of Volcadian territory continued. Eventually, peace had to be negotiated. Whereas the Cascadians wanted to force reform and colonial disbandment within Volcadia, such a reform was impossible as of Volcadia's control. However, they were able to secure some conditions, forcing Volcadia to sit down, shut up, and come to a compromise, even if the Cascadians had to do the same. The Treaty of Tartan, signed on December 16th, 1979, marked the official resolution of post-war tensions following Operation Lumberjack. The treaty laid out the terms for the dismantling of Volcadia's colonial holdings, the restructuring of regional powers, and the establishment of a lasting peace. Below is a breakdown of what Volcadia was allowed to keep, what it was required to give, and how the treaty was enforced. Volcadia was permitted to maintain its pre-war governmental structures. Despite the significant territorial and political changes imposed by the treaty, the nation's sovereignty remained intact. The treaty affirmed that Volcadia could preserve Thorax faith as its national religion, and even stated that it did not have to recognize the evolved faith as a branch of Thorax faith or even as a monotheistic religion, despite the religion worshipping one god. The nation was also granted the right to maintain and develop its military forces, ensuring its ability to defend its sovereignty and territorial integrity. But now, let us talk about what Volcadia was forced to relinquish. First, it had to dismantle its colonial empire, giving the land of Colombia, or what the Volcadians perceived to be Narsland. Ethiopiana's reunification was also acknowledged, with Volcadia restoring its southern corridors. Beyond this, it also had to transfer some territories, such as the Aleutian Islands, Alaska, Sonora, and the Yucatan. The nation also had to relinquish its diplomatic right to establish alliances outside of the North American continent, ensuring regional peace and preventing further international entanglements. The nation also had to make moderate reparations to PATO, Pacific Atlantic Treaty Organization, as a gesture of goodwill and to cement reconciliation after the conflict. Additionally, Volcadia agreed to the dissolution of the Provisional Government of Atlantica, allowing Cascadia to maintain this land under its control. Now, there was indeed a general enforcement of the treaty, including 3 points. No embargoes could be imposed on Volcadia unless it breached the treaty's terms. The treaty was to remain in force until the year 2000, or all reparations to PATO nations were fully discharged. And the treaty prevented any external interventions in Volcadian affairs, religious, economic, or military, until 2020, ensuring that Volcadia could and would be able to determine its own destiny. Now, let us talk about the aftermath in various countries. First, Volcadia. The war against Cascadia was considered the second war of survival, mirroring an earlier conflict Volcadia faced against America, in which they lost some territory but managed to survive at the last moment. However, the story of what happened in Volcadia after the war was different than what happened after the first conflict. Throughout the 1980s, Volcadia struggled to rebuild as it had to deal with an increase of crime and poverty.
The loss in the war was compounded with the death of Emperor Frederick on May 1st, 1980. His state funeral was attended by his countrymen, but very few foreign dignitaries wished to enter. Wolcadia's new emperor, William I, was crowned with an undiagnosed brain tumor, leading his reign to be the shortest of any monarch in the Alaris dynasty. And yet, towards the end of the 1980s, there was some hope. Despite still being poorer than other North American nations, Cascadian aid sent to the People's Kingdom allowed it to recover. The nation's government remained the nation's government, and it could focus on its own development rather than the development of colonies. Within Cascadia, the victory in Operation Lumberjack was much more jubilant. Cascadia renamed itself to the Greater Cascadian Republic. Its newfound rule over former Wolcadian Narslan caused great celebration, while Wolcadians in Gobarita were expected to assimilate to Cascadian rule. The joy of democracy resonated throughout newfound Cascadian territory as many elements of Cascadian pop culture spread throughout the land. In the 1980s, Cascadia experienced a golden age. Its economy grew from that of a devastating nation following a major war to the largest economy in the world in the 2000s, as its culture became universally known for its top hits. The Cascadian language, English, music, fashion, food, and even form of government spread throughout the entire world as what many would call Cascadia's national dish, poutine, became widely popular, taking the place of hamburgers. Meanwhile, Cascadia's position in North America allowed it to spread ideals of American reunification, as democratic sentiment spread throughout the continent. Many of these ideals spawned from the Cascadian homeland, as the Greater Republic took a role in increasing the support of democracy. Nowhere further did this take place than in Atlantica, which soon desired unification with Cascadia and the formation of the United States. Within Atlantica, Operation Lumberjack ended the long-time racial dispute between Wolcadian Atlanticans and American Atlanticans. Before, both races were seen as equally important to Atlantican identity, but due to pro-Wolcadian guerrillas helping the People's Kingdom instill a regime change within Atlantica, Americans within Atlantica took the dominant position as the true Atlanticans. This led to further democratization, centralization, and economic liberalization throughout the nation, as Wolcadians had to go along with these pro-American pushes without foreign aggression. In the 1980s and 90s, an increasing number of Americans within Atlantica supported the idea of joining Cascadia to perhaps reunify the United States, with there already being a push to do so since the establishment of Cascadia as a nation. Although reunificationists are still quite small in number, the popularity of reunification has increased tremendously throughout the country, with pro-Cascadian elements already winning multiple elections in the East. Following the end of pro-Wolcadian government in Atlantica, Atlantican sovereignty was protected, and democracy remained strong. Its economy experienced a similar golden age, and non-Wolcadian parts of its culture began to spread like wildfire. Soon, plans for former reformation will be made as Atlantica approaches a brave new world. Within Athanopiana, its people celebrated the reunification of the island and worked to ensure that the peace and security ensured by the war could continue. Throughout the 1980s, Athanopiana used its newfound naval might to become the undisputed superpower of the Pacific, pushing democratic reform and ensuring the peaceful establishment of Pacific republics loyal to the new democratic order. The powerful navy of Athanopiana has led it to become a center of trade throughout the world, using its dominance not only over the Aleutian Islands, but also to the newly independent Alaskan Republic to ensure security throughout the Pacific Ocean. As the People's Kingdom of Wilcadia continued to hold to its authoritarian ideology, Ethanopiana spread its culture around and promoted democratic institutions throughout its sphere of influence. The biggest example of nation-building post-war was in the newly established Republic of Alaska. Under Wilcadian rule, Alaska was the home of the exiled Romanov dynasty, who viewed Wilcadia as the only hope from the perceived threats of communist invasion and liberal reform. Following Ethanopianan liberation, the Romanov dynasty itself was tried by the new Alaskan government for multiple crimes, from coercing the Russian people to drink themselves to death to cooperating with the regressive People's Kingdom. The Romanov dynasty was found guilty of these crimes, and all Romanov-owned estates and artifacts were seized by the Ethanopianan court. The most notable change within Ethanopiana was a comprehensive political reform following the war, in which the socialist democracy shifted to the right in terms of economics. Ethanopianan President Ronald Reagan stated to the world his wishes to keep the government off everyone's backs, and under his leadership this position remained true. The word socialist was knocked off the republic's definition, renaming the nation into the Federal Republic of Ethanopiana. Now, the biggest question here. Was Operation Lumberjack a success? Operation Lumberjack was a heroic David and Goliath story in which the small coalition of Pado managed to beat back the most powerful colonial empire in the world, all while receiving international aid. Despite it boasting about its colonial prosperity and military might, it proved surprisingly vulnerable to Pado and was deeply humbled by the actions of the war. Before calling Operation Lumberjack a true success, however, we must take a look at the goals of Pado against Wilcadia. 1. Transfers control of the Duchy of Norseland to Cascadia for self-determination. 2. Dissolve the Wilcadian Empire and its colonial alliances. This includes giving back the lands of Tartan to Ethanopiana. 3. Implement democratic reforms, including multi-party elections. 4. Separate church and state, protect Christian minority rights. And 5. Reduce military pressure through demilitarization. How well did Pado do in this ultimatum? As it turns out, only 2 points within this ultimatum were enforced. The Cascadian Republic was unable to enforce democratic reform, separate church and state, or reduce the military presence of Wilcadia. Thus, the core problems within the authoritarian People's Kingdom of Wilcadia were able to persist. And not only that, Wilcadia was prohibited from sanctions by Pado members after the war, legitimizing the regime even more. Still, a look after the war sees Cascadia and other Pado members spreading democratic ideals throughout the world against the wishes of the isolated Wilcadia. Ethanopiana, Cascadia, and Atlantica are now widely recognized as heroic powers who fought for freedom, while Wilcadia had still yet to rebuild its international image following the war. Although many would argue that the war against Wilcadia was a success, the operation was not, as not all goals had been enforced. This leads us to the lessons that can be learned from Operation Lumberjack. First and foremost, Operation Lumberjack underscored the resilience of democratic values in the face of authoritarian regimes. The ultimatum issued by President George Wallace of Cascadia demanded democratic reforms in Wilcadia, emphasizing the fundamental belief that democracy will ultimately prevail over oppression. While the operation demonstrated the power of determination and international support in confronting authoritarianism, the internal political dynamics of Wolcadia presented hurdles in achieving comprehensive democratic transformation. The significance of international aid and support in ensuring the triumph of democracy cannot be overstated. Partnerships with nations like Atlantica and Ethanopiana bolstered Cascadia's efforts in this operation, highlighting the importance of collective action in promoting democratic ideals worldwide. The collaboration between nations showcased the impact of solidarity and cooperation in challenging authoritarian regimes and reinforcing democratic values, reinforcing the notion that no nation stands alone in the pursuit of freedom and human rights. However, Operation Lumberjack also revealed the complexities of post-conflict reconstruction and the limitations of military victories. While the military campaign achieved some objectives, the persistence of authoritarian practices within Wolcadia post-conflict raised questions in the efficacy of force alone in promoting democratic reform. The realization that winning the war does not always guarantee a successful transition to democracy underscores the multifaceted nature of nation building and the need for comprehensive strategies beyond military intervention. Ultimately, Operation Lumberjack serves as a reminder that the forces of freedom, progress, and democracy will always triumph over authoritarian regimes. This is a guarantor of our unity here. And as Charles Oserwanch once stated, all empires are supernovae, and it is time that the Wolcadian supernova dies down.